Okay, so this week we got context, and this is going to be part one of a two-part series. Part two is going to be the demo. Part one is going to be the explanation of the idea mostly because it's a little bit more in-depth and complex. But Bob is super excited this week because we got a story to tell you. So once upon a time, I started a job. There was me, big smile and everything. I had a boss, and she comes to me and she says, Max, our revenues for the company year over year are up 10%. So me being a new employee, I said, well, what am I supposed to do with that? Is that good? Is that bad? How do I evaluate that? So I became confused. And when I said that, she said, well, let me give you a little bit of context behind the situation. The industry as a whole is down 30%. So now when she gave me that context, I said, well, heck yeah, we're up 10%. We must be doing pretty good, right? So I'll kind of pause the story here for a second and look at, evaluate just what happened, right, in that instant. Before she provided me the context, the information that she gave me originally, that 10% revenue increase, was not really valuable. It didn't really tell me anything. It didn't really allow me to draw that insight, that knowledge ultimately, right, to understand what was going on. The second she gave me the context, she gave me the information and she painted that picture in the background behind it to allow me to kind of like evaluate against that backdrop. And now I, as the person on the other end, could draw that insight, could draw that conclusion. So that's where context becomes an integral part of knowledge management, because without context, you cannot transfer knowledge. You can transfer information, but you cannot transfer knowledge. Just as an example here. And it kind of also, to extend it a little bit, it goes a step further to think about like, well, if I can share information back and forth to transmit ideas, can I manipulate context to also transmit ideas, to transmit that knowledge? And is it, important in knowledge transmission? And the answer is kind of like yes. So here's an example to kind of just show it through an example rather than explaining it. Imagine if my boss came and she said, hey, the revenues are up 10%, but the industry as a whole is up 90%. Well, at that point, I'd probably say I joined the wrong company. But the insight that I drew is different, even though the initial information that she gave me was the same. The revenues are up 10%. So the only thing that changed was the context and the background, and all of a sudden, I drew a different conclusion, different piece of knowledge, different insight. And so that's where context, we start to kind of like think about it, well, okay, we need to manage context in addition to managing what we're saying, like information-wise, that back and forth and dialogue, and also are we setting the context appropriately? To kind of motivate it just a little bit further, context has a lot of applications outside of just conversation design. For example, in business a lot of times, and probably over the past couple of decades now, there's a big shift towards storytelling. Tell stories, get away from PowerPoints, they say. Stories are engaging, they're fun, they're interesting. People are actually listening to you. They're actually learning something rather than just falling asleep in the middle of your slide deck. And the reason for that is every story starts with background. It starts with context development. It doesn't start by me giving you like the insight up front. It starts by developing that scene, setting that stage, so to speak. That's part of context development. And the people who are good like storytellers, they're really good at setting that context and building it up before they kind of give you that final bit, before they give you that denouement where things get unraveled and light bulbs go off and the insight comes out, everything becomes self-apparent. Up until that point, they're kind of setting the stage. They're building that context. And that's what makes storytelling so powerful and, another application of context management. So hopefully that kind of motivates it. Besides just conversation design, there are other applications of it. So it's kind of a fun topic to think about. But let me kind of like define context a little bit more, because right now I'm just kind of giving an example and hopefully making it somewhat interesting. But there are a couple of ways to look at context and really refine the definition of it. And some of our friends over at Cybernetics, areas of studies that I've read, had an interesting idea, and they broke it down, and I never thought about it this way. There's two kind of ways to look at it. One is representative type of a problem. So in that way, you're thinking about context is what I just described. It's a background, that setting that you find yourself in, right? It could be, for example, a location, like in the context of this living room. Okay, that's a physical location, but we can make it a little bit more abstract and say in the context of today. So now all of a sudden context becomes like a time type of a event, type of a dimension setting. We can even make it even more abstract. I can say in the context of this topic, in the context of this discussion. So now the context is like the idea that we're talking about, like the topic of discussion, that theme. So in those cases, context is very static. It's very like set in stone. It's kind of like around us, right? So that's one way to think about it. The second one that's very applicable to conversation design, and it's a little bit way out there and something that I've learned at least. I never thought about it that way, but it makes a lot of sense, is it's an interactive problem. It's a process. It's not something that's set in stone, but it's something that develops perhaps in the course of a conversation. That's why conversation design is a really good place to practice context management. And so here's kind of the definition of it that Day and some of his colleagues had that I thought was appropriate. Any information that can be used to characterize the situation of entities, which is just like people, places, things, that are considered relevant to the interaction between a user and an application. So the keyword there is interaction. That idea that the user is doing something, they're working towards something, they're using the application, and they're going back and forth, and the context is being developed in the course of it. So context is ultimately something that we're kind of like negotiating, and ultimately coming to that idea of like a shared meeting where we are seeing eye to eye. And that really sounds abstract until you start to think about this idea of natural interfaces. Aren't we naturally doing it? And the answer is, yeah. You think about how often do you hear somebody say they're trying to explain something and they can't get the idea, and they're like, well, let me paint you a picture. So what are they about to do? Well, they're about to start developing your context in your mind, that picture, so then they can finally get their idea across to you, right? That's what they're really doing, and that's where it's like an interactive problem. Also, we're kind of cool because when we're talking about like dialogue and conversation design, you're negotiating context. So you're not just like coming in and saying, okay, context is set. We can change the context. For example, imagine this scenario. Somebody walks into my living room and they say, Max, this room is small. You live in a tiny, tiny apartment. And then I might say, well, you know, it's not so small considering I pay $100 a month for rent. I don't, but just for a fictitious example, I wish. And all of a sudden they say, well, in that case, maybe it's not such a small room. What did I just do? The dimensions of my room didn't change, right? I gave them information to change their context, and now they're thinking of my room differently. So context and like ultimately the knowledge management and conversation design, when they start to converge, we're ultimately talking about changing people's perception, which is a huge part about user experience design. It's like that idea, when we talk about human perception, we're ultimately starting to circle a different drain, which is cognition and, you know, awareness, and ultimately general purpose AI is kind of like where we're headed, but that's not the point of this video. But we're starting to kind of get it to an idea that context and experience overall is like in the user's mind, and we can manipulate it in all of these ways. So if we can masterfully swirl around all these ideas, this context, knowledge management, conversation design, into this nice, delightful concoction that we use called user experience, then, you know, we're pretty good at designing ultimately. And so hopefully that starts to formulate a different idea about context and why it's kind of like important. But to dial it down just a little bit, because I'll leave it at that. I know it's a little bit of a cliffhanger in terms of, you know, cognition and some of these other more advanced topics that I'm not qualified to talk about, and I haven't read enough about yet to regurgitate anything interesting. But let's really back into conversation design as the last step. So when we talk about context and managing context, how do we do it in a conversation design? So one way to do it is in hierarchies, and do it in a sequence level. So that's that step level. So in dialogue, usually I say something, you say something, I say something, you say something. One round trip back and forth is an adjacency pair. That's what it's called, or a conversational step. So we can manage context at that level. Things like inquiry, extended telling, repeat requests, which I'll kind of cover some of these things later on. They can be managed at that level. Next level of context that we can manage. So the context overall is not like a one thing. You have lots of context that you can manage. But for conversation design, we're limited to just 3. Sequence or flow level. So that's your sequence closers. You can manage those. Sequence aborts, you can manage them at the context level. And then last but not least is the context of the overall conversation. So certain things are easier to manage at that conversational level, means they're very generic. They can apply to anywhere within our conversation. So for example, the user starts cursing at the system. Well, it doesn't matter what flow, what step they're on, the system could just react appropriately, react the same way, and just say, I'm not going to talk to you. That's it. We're done. I'm out of here. So in that example, the sequence, that's the conversation repair mechanism, is managed at the conversational context level, in the context of the overall conversation. And so in Dialogflow, I'll show kind of in the demo, there are methods where you can create a hierarchy of contexts and manage different things to solve different kind of conversational problems, ultimately. So that's pretty much it. I'm at 10 minutes. That's why I broke this down into 2 halves, because it's a big topic. There's a lot to it. But hopefully that kind of starts to give a little bit of an indication of what context is and why it's important. And then the next demo, I'll kind of talk a little bit about actually logic structures and show you on Bob how to I manage context, at least at the very primitive level, and how anybody can approach to start managing context. So that's pretty much it. Thanks for watching.